Thousands of activists are gathering nationwide to commemorate the 1963 March on Washington. Officials are expecting about 50,000 people to attend the event in our nation's capital. The march will pass by Black Lives Matter Plaza, the White House, and the Washington Monument before ending at a rally at the Lincoln Memorial. The demonstrations will call on lawmakers to take federal action against state voting laws that make it hard for minorities, people with physical disabilities, and young people, among others, to cast a ballot. 58 years ago, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led more than 250,000 demonstrators on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Now his son, Martin Luther King III, is following his father's footsteps, helping to organize the marches. He joined CBSN on Friday and said that the country needs federal action similar to the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
It is wrong to restrict the rights of voters, and that we must ensure that everyone has the right to vote unencumbered, and voting rights should be expanded. People last year were told to come out and vote, and they did in mass numbers, more than ever before. So why then, since January 6th, have there been 400 bills passed to restrict people's ability to vote? That, to me, is sad.
Joining us now is Nicole Killian and Antoine Seawright. Nicole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. She's there at the marches. And Antoine is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. Antoine, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. How significant are the marches today, and how will history look at this moment in time?
Well, thank you for having me on such an important historical day. I think the marches are important. They perhaps are just as important as they were in the days of my parents and sharecropper grandparents. Keep in mind that for Black people, as we are on our path, this pursuit towards perfection, we're still fighting for very much so rights and for the fight of our lives every single day. In 1963, 58 years ago, there were so many things going on in the ecosystem that dictated the impact of these marches. Emmett Till, 14-year-old Black kid from Mississippi, was lynched for offending a white woman. All across the South, you had sit-ins and marches taking place. There were dogs being unleashed on Black people for protesting. And some of those things brought the March on Washington to be a reality. The fact of the matter is some of the very things that were happening in 1963, an attack on our voting rights, racism, bigotry, and hate, infrastructure issues, housing issues, so many of those things are going on today, and that's why you see so many people gathering, not just in Washington, D.C., but all across the country, because we're still in the fight for our lives and our rights.
Nicole, civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King III, are pushing lawmakers to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. Can you explain to our viewers what's in that legislation?
Too many think that young folks
well, not only those organizers, but also the many people who are gathered here at this march are calling for passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would in essence restore provisions in the 1965 Voting Rights Act that became law more than 50 years ago. And the cornerstone of that is this requirement for clearance, where certain jurisdictions, especially those who may have previously had a history of discrimination, would have to get approval from the Justice Department before they could make changes to their voting laws. And I did have a chance to speak with Martin Luther King III, have an extended conversation with him after your conversation. And, you know, in essence, he says, especially with all of these restrictive laws that have passed now in more than a dozen states, it's essential to have this kind of federal oversight.
Dr. King said freedom is never voluntarily given by...
And Nicole, the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act on Tuesday. What obstacles, though, does it face in the Senate?
Truth crushed the earth, but rise again. Truth is rising.
Well, it faces an uphill battle, as you know, which is the dynamic with a lot of legislation right now on Capitol Hill, is that it would require at least 10 Senate Republicans to sign on to this legislation. And right now, those numbers simply aren't there yet. We saw earlier in the year when the Senate, there weren't enough Republicans to support S1, the For the People Act, which was a broader, sweeping elections reform package. And it's kind of a similar potential fate for this John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Advancement Act, although it is a little narrower in scope, the hope is maybe they can build support for it. But again, right now, those votes are not there. Short of that, there are calls to end the filibuster or potentially have a carve-out to the filibuster to try to get some of this voting rights legislation too. But even that is going to be a heavy lift. And that is why you see this demonstration right in front of the Capitol, because the folks here say they want their message to be heard loud and clear by these lawmakers.
Loud and clear indeed, Nicole. We're definitely hearing it and trying to hear you over it, as you said, in case any of our viewers had difficulty making it out, that 10 Senate Republicans would need to cross over party lines and vote to support the Lewis Voting Rights Act. But at this point, it does not seem that they have those votes, complicating matters further, of course, the filibuster. So, Antoine, what do you think could happen if this legislation is not passed?
Well, I think it's going to have a push and pull effect. One, I think it's going to push black people in particular more to organize, strategize, and turn out and register our voters like we never have before. So there's your push effect, but also it's going to pull back in its own way, just by way of the legislation. Is going to pull people away from the polls in some places, in some scenarios. When you're penalized for giving someone water standing in their line to vote with a precinct that may have been moved across town or that does not have enough voting machines in place to support the persons in line, or doesn't have enough staff, or some of these things we've seen as black people in some of our precincts around the country, is naturally going to have a pull, an effect in a negative way. But I'll remind our Democratic lawmakers who have both the House and the Senate in the majority, in any given election, Lana, black people are casting a survival vote. And so elections for us are about life and death. And so when we cannot show up to the polls as we need to, when our votes are suffocated or suppressed, you're literally saying you do not mind some of our communities and some of us not having the necessary functions we need for survival. And that's why this issue is so important. Sadly, the same way 200 and some odd thousand people gathered in D.C. 58 years ago at the March on Washington. You see people gathering all around the country because we know what this means, not just for today, but we know what it means for tomorrow. Think about if black people did not come out and vote in November up and down that ballot. One, we would not have a House and a Senate. We would not have a Democratic president. And think about some of the most consequential and comprehensive pieces of legislation that have passed and been signed into law by President Biden, all because black people showed up to vote. And that's why going forward, these elections are so important. And that's why so many people who do not look like us are working so hard to suffocate and suppress our votes.
All right. Nicole Killian, Antoine C. Wright, thank you both.